Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar on feeding canola, hay and silage to livestock. My name's Jane Court. I'm with Agriculture Victoria and I'm speaking to you out of Bendigo today. For those of you who have been on some of our sheep and beef ones before, we've made today one early afternoon rather than an evening, just so that we can be more accommodating to our dairy farmers. So welcome across the board to our beef, sheep and our dairy farmers today. I have been around for quite a while, and the last time I chaired a session on exactly the same topic as this was in 2006, when I guess we back then saw high grain prices and a lot of canola cut to hay. But I guess the good thing about repeating some of these scenarios is that we learn from them. And in that vein, I guess we have today for this seminar two experts in this field online. They're going to talk to you about feeding canola, hay and silage and the market. So these two presenters are Colin Peace of Jumba Consulting and Brett Davidson of Agriculture Victoria. So they're going to give an overview of the current canola crop situation, quality and availability of product, and some tips on feeding canola, silage and hay to sheep or cattle. So we'll run the webinar. It will go for an hour, and that will include time for questions, which we'll leave to the end of the two presentations. So can I suggest if you have a question as we go that you write them down so that you don't forget them. If you're participating through your computer, you can type your question in the chat box, which I think should be on the left-hand bottom side of your screen. If it's something just about clarification, we might be able to address it as we go. Otherwise, we'll come back to those ones at the end. So write them down or hang on to them and make sure you ask at the end. So to get us going, though, I'll hand it over first to Brett Davidson. Brett is a dairy extension officer with our dairy team in Agriculture Victoria based at Tatura. So Brett's going to talk about all the issues involved with feeding canola to livestock. So over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Jane. I've certainly got a bit to get through, and I'll just reinforce that if you have a question, please send it through and we'll endeavour to answer it. Trying to cover everything might be pretty hard, but we'll give it a go. And certainly this year there's quite a few questions coming thick and fast around canola. What I'd like to say first is that, I've had a fair bit of experience with the product as well. And the first time we did do a lot of these questions and was in 2006 in that dry season, as Jane said. So when you ask people about canola, you usually get a pretty mixed response. So you get people that love it or hate it, and some people in between. But for me, I reckon it makes an excellent forage during drought years. But there's certainly quite a few issues that can go along with it. So we've done. There's been some palatability trials done. Just some student trials at Dookie, and we actually use canola, wheat, hay and silage, and use good and bad samples of both, or poor samples of both. And we actually did a bit of a palatability trial, and the actual cattle preferred the canola over the well-made wheat, hay and silage. So once they get a taste for it, they're usually pretty good. But there is a big difference between the well-made stuff and the poor-made stuff. So the margin of error with canola is a lot finer than some other products, and we'll certainly endeavour to go through that a bit later. This year it'll make a valuable protein source. So being a brassica, it's actually quite good in protein, and usually well-made stuff will feed test very well. This year I think canola meal and cottonseed meal maybe a little bit shorter than usual, or certainly more expensive. So for some of us, canola may make a better product, or a cheaper protein source, and make up a good part of the diet. So when we're getting to hay and silage, like we've had a few questions about silage and curing times at the moment. You know, what I'd probably like to say with that, you know, ideally you'd like to wait 3 or 4 weeks for silage. It's a fermentation process. But for those that are pushed for feed at the moment, you know, you don't have to wait that long. Ideally you would, but if it means the difference between not feeding your animals and feeding your animals, you don't really need to wait. So ideally you'd wait 3 or 4 days once it's wrapped to try and start that process off. But if you have to feed it immediately, you can. The difference you'll see is the palatability will drop, and it won't be fully ensiled. So as long as it's being fed out and eaten quickly, you can do feed it out fairly promptly. With silage, there's certainly, with canola being a stalky product, with any silage, air's the enemy. So you really need to pack it and wrap it tight. So, and don't just set it and forget it. So if you've got round bales like this picture here, you need to be going along and checking to make sure that those that plastic isn't compromised and punctured. And what you need to be doing is actually just have some plastic to reseal that to make sure you're keeping the air out. Canola is quite a spongy product, and what we find is with the old machines, it didn't pack real tight. So part of the reason that that canola got a bad name in 2006 was people using old machinery that didn't pack very tight and then not maintaining the air tightness of their silage stacks or bales. So that was certainly something that came up again and again. Righto. So what to look for in canola? If you're getting hay and silage, you know, what we'd like to see is mid to late flowering with the cut. So most crops would be past this now, but if you're getting hay or silage, there still should be some flower in there. A lot of it does drop off during the hay making or silage making process, but it still needs to have some flower in there. Fine stems, obviously. That's good. Conditioning is fairly critical, and this comes back to the palatability issue. So either, you know, some people call it macerating or super conditioning, or it needs to be, those stems need to be thoroughly cracked all the way along, and that's just to do with the actual physical aspect of putting it into animals' mouth. So it's not just a curing thing. It does speed up curing, but it's also a palatability issue more with canola than some other things. And good leaf retention. So, you know, you want to see a fairly leafy crop. Unfortunately, there's still stuff being cut now in my area, and, you know, it's past flowering. You know, some of the stems have started to thicken, and a lot of leaf drop too. So what we're going to see is the feed quality drop off in some of the later samples. All right, I'm going to talk a bit about feed here and feed tests. So we've had a few questions to start off with about feed testing. I'll talk about NDF first. So NDF, neutral detergent fibre, it's a measurement that we use to see how much fibres in the hay or silage sample. And a rough rule of thumb is the bigger the number, the longer it's going to take to pass through the cow's rumen or sheep's rumen. So and as a general rule of thumb, a very rough rule of thumb, high NDFs obviously go to more like straws, and then when you're seeing those high NDF figures, animals can actually fill themselves up and still lose body condition. So they'll be physically full, but they won't produce. So this one here in this example of 77, you know, that's, you know, my cut-off point would be 60 if you're looking to maintain body weight in most types of feed. So when you get into 70, that's a pretty stalky straw product. I don't even have to look at that type of sample to say that that's the cattle are going to, or sheep are going to, animals are going to struggle to perform on that. On the flip side, when you're down to 25, so for cattle and you sort of want an NDF above 30. So this stuff would be really rich, and you'd see the manure going through quite quickly and fairly soft. But you look at the average of 41, and that'd be fantastic in this type of year. We talk energy. Most diets with energy, which is metabolizable energy, which shows up on your sheet. 9 to 10 is what we usually work on in animals' diets, and that's usually a good figure. You can go down to 8.5, and anything above that's good. But certainly these samples down to 4 are pretty challenging. So yeah, animals wouldn't be able to eat enough of that type of feed to run a production system. And then conversely, then we get the other side of these ones up around 13 ME. They're certainly full of sugars and very rich, so they're usually pretty good. The other one that we'll talk about is crude protein. When we talk about crude proteins, if we're getting a basic NIR test, which is your basic feed test, crude protein, it actually doesn't differentiate between nitrates and proteins in the plant. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. And certainly if you're getting certainly protein percentages above 24%, I'd be certainly looking for a nitrate test as well. So it's a bit more expensive, but the feed test labs that can all do it. It does take a bit longer, but it's only, you're only talking a few days turnaround, not weeks. I've used 2006 and 7 samples, mainly because it's the most similar to this type of year, similar type of conditions, and during these types of years, we tend to see the best samples and the worst samples. So we will, so if you have a look at the 2018 samples, there's only a few that have come through. I've got some more from feed testing, but I didn't have time to load them. So we've got these, 15 to 20, 9 to 12, and 32 to 45. These are all well-made early samples, and like you can give them to any class of stock and they'll perform very well on them. Conversely, we'll see these high NDF, low energy, low protein ones come out later with people that, as the season rolls on, tend to get a bit more, the difference between a good and bad farmer is usually 2 weeks. And when we see figures like this is a bit longer than 2 weeks. But there'll be product that'll be cut past its use by date, and it'll be put on the open market. So, we really need to be emphasising we need to get our feed tests and weigh dockets this year. So just briefly on here, if we're trying to get animals to grow and perform or lactate, we sort of want to see about a 14% protein in the diet. And certainly grower and finisher rations, you sort of want to have about 15 to 16. Some dairy rations will probably even go high to 18 for early lactation. So, you want to see some pretty handy protein percentages. I wouldn't recommend feeding protein percentages below 10% for any long periods to any class of stock. The animals will get away with it for a while, but if we're going into a long dry year and it's going to be their sole source of feed, I'd hope people are trying to find some pretty good fodder around at least for a good proportion of their diet. This is a feed test here. So just to give you the layout and how to read it, you've got your dry matter percentage there, so that's how much it's taking the water component out. So you've got your protein, as we've done here, your energy, and they're the main things you want to look at if you want to go any further, and your NDF here. So they're the main things you want to look at with the feed test. And feed tests from other labs are slightly different. But what I'd like to say is that all of them should have on here Australian Fodder Industry approved methods. Anyone that's in the AFIA network for feed testing, it gives us confidence that they're getting their machines calibrated regularly, and that the feed test that we're getting is fairly going to be very accurate. It'll be more accurate than the samples being taken, to be honest. And then when you're taking your feed test samples, just don't go grabbing one bit out of one bale. You certainly want to take a representative sample across the load. Ideally, you'll have a corer, but certainly mix those samples up to make sure you're getting a spread. All right. Here's a vendor declaration, and this year will be certainly these will be more critical, and it's part of your requirements for any quality assurance program. Certainly nitrates may be an issue this year with some late fertilised crops. And when I talk about these potential risks, they're out there, but we don't see them too often. And if you do see them, you just need to be making sure you're sanding, that type of thing. We have seen some high oil content, so that'll be product that's cut late where the animals are getting a lot of feed. I haven't seen that too often. Mould and toxins come through with any feed. Canola, because it doesn't pack super well unless you've got a high density machine, there is a slight higher risk than some of the other crops. Chemical residues, with the dry finish to the season, something that we cannot be fully aware of is that how long that some of these products takes for them to go through the system. So, usually they're done on a normal withhold period, but with it being dry, some of them can change ever so slightly. So just make sure you're getting those things. Genetically modified crops. Genetically modified crops are safe to feed and eat to all classes of animals and people. The thing I'd ask you to watch out for is what type of quality assurance program you're in, and then what the requirements are. So some dairy companies use it in part of their marketing that they ask for a 95% free. Certainly some of your pasture fed, like your PCAS and some of the other programs all have different types of requirements. So if you're just feeding breeders and you're keeping them at home, quite happy for you to feed as much GMO crop as you like. But if you are selling into a market, please make sure. And this fodder declaration has that marked on here too, so that's just a little GMO box there. So if you're getting that, you're all good for your end markets. Rumen penetrations, this is on here. It actually came out from the department in 2006. We didn't have a lot of information on canola, and it probably took off it as a rumour. The only information we had was some information overseas that we couldn't verify. So we actually put it out. But I've actually checked with the knackeries after the 2006 period, and there was no penetrations from canola. The only ones they'd ever had were from wire. So even though it is a stalky product, as a general rule, I'd say rumen penetrations are a myth, but if someone's got some information that can contradict that off air, I'm quite happy to take it on, but at the moment we haven't seen any. Just be careful of your method of feeding. Obviously we're paying a fair bit for feed and fodder this year. Just be careful of your wastage, and obviously the way you feed the product has an influence about how much is used too. So, you know, if you're feeding it just hay on the ground, obviously you just need to be mindful of feed waste, hay rings. As long as there's enough head spacings, certainly animals will. Most of the hay should stay in there, or silage, and should be eaten. So what I'd like to do, say during this season, is about all feeds do have a limitation. It doesn't matter whether it's pure sub or canola or anything like that. If animals are getting too much of one thing for a long period, you know, there is a slight increased chance of a complication. And if you are having an issue, you know, there's an old rule that dilution is the solution. So if you're mixing, say, if you're just feeding full canola and you start to see an issue with nitrates, or you've got a hazer feed with high nitrates, blend it with something else. So put it out, if you're putting it out 50-50 with something else, you know, you should be reducing your risk and really shouldn't be having an issue. This year, feed tests are mandatory, I think, so this should be part of your business practice anyway. You know, we do run businesses. Feed test and weigh dockets are going to be just compulsory at any time, but this year it's really going to make the difference for those that aren't doing it. You know, because if you're 25% out on either of these or both of these, you could be effectively doubling the cost of your feed. And we did see this type of thing happen in the last dry season, 2006, where people were paying up to $600 a tonne when we worked it out, because they weren't getting those two simple things. If you're having an issue with anything, certainly get advice from a professional, so talk to your vet or a nutritionist. I know there's plenty of people out there that have got good advice, but you know, sometimes you need to be a bit careful where you get it from. So, you know, certainly the pub's got some good advice on some things, but certainly when we're talking about nutrition, I'd hope that you try and get someone that's a bit qualified. So for the summary, you know, if you're making canola, hay or silage, you know, make sure you're cutting it early and getting that quality in there. Feed tests and weigh dockets are mandatory, and really try and keep that feed wastage to a minimum. And if you're having any dietary problems, you know, just try and spread the load of that product and you know, blend it with something else to try and balance the diet. I've got a bit of further reading here for anyone that's interested. Certainly the GRDC canola, hay and silage fact sheet's just been updated, and that provides a lot of good information out there to everybody. Also, there's also Dairy Australia's got a hay and wastage hay and silage wastage page. There's certainly some really good information. It's applicable to all classes of livestock, so please feel free to read through those good resources. All right, well that will do me. So I'll hand over to Colin now, or Jean.
Thanks, Brett. Spot on time. That was excellent. So I'll just reinforce, you can ask, there'll be opportunity to ask Brett questions at the end. But now I will hand over to Colin Peace. So Colin Peace is from Jumbuck Ag Consulting, and he's going to talk about the hay market situation. Colin's presented for us quite a few times before as an expert grain and fodder analyst, and or some of you might read his Hay Talk Grain Talks, I think, aren't they, in the Weekly Times, Colin? I just might get you, Colin, as you go through, to identify the slides, just in case there are a few people online who are not looking at on their computer, like they're looking at the handout. But otherwise, over to you.
Happy to, Jane. Thank you, and good day, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. Pretty interesting times we live in, and made only more interesting by the fact that we've got some options around feeding with canola hay presenting itself again after a 10-year break. Like Jane said, there was a lot of it around the last national drought, and it's meant that there's been a lot of lessons learned, and quite honestly, I reckon the growers of canola hay have really got their act together this year and have made a really good shot at making some decent quality hay. But we'll get into the presentation and going to the next step. So look, we're just going to step you through the 4 things on the agenda here. What's driving the hay market overall? What's the canola hay production been like? Where are the canola hay prices at the moment? And try to pull it together with a few conclusions at the end. I'm showing a map here of the frosts that hit throughout southeastern Australia in late September, and there was some absolute cracker frosts, as you can see here, that hit particularly the Golden Valley, the Riverina, and some big chunks of the Wimmera Mallee, with temperatures down to 3 degrees below zero, some down to -6 as well. That's the thing that gave all the canola growers the heebie-jeebies, and they saw that they had pretty decent biomass in their crops, and were really not optimistic at all about the prospects of getting any of their pods to actually fill. They were pessimistic with rain. Forecasts at that time were very dry, so that got the whole canola hay ball rolling back then. Just to sort of step you through how the hay market works, and to understand how canola works, you need to look at the bigger hay market. So in Victoria, I've got a graph here of the makeup of hay that is grown in Victoria. It's a bit of a jagged story because of the droughts we've had previously. But the take home from this is the fact that we've got a green area here representing the pasture hay, particularly when you combine it with the blue up the top, which is the silage. Between those two, you've pretty much got 2/3 of all hay and silage grown in Victoria coming from pasture sources. So even though pasture hay is not the typical thing we trade, it ultimately determines the makeup of what the demand's going to be. And there is some chronic rainfall for particularly September in northern Victoria, and there's going to be very poor production of pasture hay this year in those areas, and the jury's still out on what's going to be the makeup of pasture hay production in southern Victoria, Gippsland and the southwest. But there's a red flag there for hay prices overall. If that pasture hay crop is as poor as it's kind of shaping up, there's going to be some pretty impressive hay demand for Victoria, on top of what's already happening out of the drought markets of Queensland and New South Wales. Just stepping into the same information a little bit differently, this graph is a pie graph of where all of the pasture and lucerne hay is grown in Victoria, and pretty much backs up the same thing, 38% in the Western District, and you've got a lot of big chunk of hay in the Gippsland as well, West Gippsland, East Gippsland. So it's the fortunes of southern Victoria which are going to decide a big chunk of what's going to happen with the hay market this year. The drought in the north is continuing, and it is continuing to pull demand and pull Victorian hay north. The epicentre for the grain market is the Riverina. The epicentre for the hay market is probably a little bit further north than that, but this map here shows all the road train routes. The green lines in New South Wales are the road train routes, matched with the red lines, which are the road train routes in Victoria. Crossing those three bridges across the Murray, I reckon last year there was something like 400,000 tonnes of Victorian hay in the 12 months to the end of June would have left Victoria to New South and Queensland. A similar amount probably came out of South Australia as well. So it's a massive chunk. When you consider Victoria generally grows around 2.8 million tonnes in an average year of hay. Personally, I can't imagine that New South Wales graziers are going to be buying the same volume of hay again this year. Culling and affordability and rain, I think, will probably change that equation a little, but it's anybody's guess at this stage. So getting into the hay markets now, for canola hay, I've got a photo on the screen here which is a typical canola windrow back in 2006. I took this photo up at Elmore, and it's not of leaf there, pretty stalking looking stuff. You know, a lot of dairy farms at the time were saying, look, I really got no option, but I'm buying sticks inside string. You know, canola hay is not pretty looking stuff, but if you can put it through a mixer wagon or put it on a feed pad and mix it up with some other stuff, you can perhaps get away with it. But it was not pretty stuff back in '06. This year, the season has got off to an early start. A lot of the canola growers have taken on board the lessons they've learnt 10 years ago, and when those frosts started hitting September and perhaps even a little bit earlier, they really got into their canola. And as many of you are probably already well aware, massive chunks of the production of the canola planted area throughout the Goulburn Valley, the Riverina, have been bowled over. You know, there's people talk about 80 to 90% of the canola hay in the Goulburn Valley, for instance, been cut for hay. There's been also, that's reflected through the Loddon Campaspe areas as well. You know, just north and west of Bendigo. I might say there's probably a lot of canola growers out there kicking themselves that they were so anxious about getting into their canola hay. We've had some late rains. There's been canola hay bales and removed from paddocks, but because of late rains, there's been a proliferation of regrowth, and the country's full of, you know, flowering regrowth, indicative of the fact that had they left some of those canola stands, they could have actually got quite a reasonable production from it eventually. But that has been a consequence of the mild conditions and late rains that came as a consequence of just after they baled their hay. So from a consumer's viewpoint, that's a good thing. From a canola making perspective, it's probably a bad thing. But the big take-homes this year, and Brett's mentioned a lot on the quality, which is terrific. The big thing is that the stems this year are much thinner, and because it's been cut much earlier. And if you can get those stem thickness down, you can get some reasonable quality hay so that it's not going to be the wastage that it was previously. You know, you talked previously about the fact that you could get, you know, 20–30% of the crop of the canola hay just not eaten by livestock. Trying to pull this together now in what it means for the big picture for the hay market. Here's my stab in the dark bar graphs on what Victoria would normally grow in a reasonable year with the green lines, the green columns, and my stab in the dark for 2018. You can see a few things here. Obviously, pasture hay way back from what it was before. The cereal hay, big increase. Obviously, a lot of crops being cut in the Wimmera Mallee. You know, that's 1.2 million tonnes on its own. The other crops, I'd reckon there's probably around 250,000 tonnes of canola hay cut, which is put into the other crop category here. Silage down again, because primarily that's going to be a pasture-based product, and the pasture is down this year. So overall, we would say Victoria's production for hay overall is going to be about average, perhaps more than what you'd normally expect. But of course, we're facing some pretty massive demand out there as well, and New South Wales is not going away. So look, just getting into where the canola hay and where the hay is this year. This is a graph of the different regions in Victoria showing the percentages of the total canola, of the total cereal hay that is normally made in the state. And you can see here, Loddon Campaspe is a big chunk, Goulburn Valley surprisingly large amount, Wimmera, 16, about an eighth of the total crop. The Mallee not so much, but you generally get some very high quality cereal hay from up that way. Overlaying that, this is where you would expect this year to actually find the majority of the hay. The yellow shaded areas being where the cereal hay is primarily going to be based. Of course, there's smatterings of hay outside those areas. A lot of the grain crops outside the yellow areas are just not good enough to bale for hay. They just don't have the biomass to justify the contracting. But in terms of canola hay, I would be suggesting that you're going to find pretty much 40% of the canola hay is going to come out of the Goulburn Valley this year. You're going to get about a quarter coming out of the northeast of Victoria, and surprisingly not so much out of the Mallee. You might struggle to get 10% out of the Mallee, and out of the Wimmera you might find 20% of Victoria's canola hay coming out of the Wimmera. So the GV and the northeast and the Riverina are a massive part of the equation. So prices. This is a big picture graph of how hay prices have behaved over the last 12 months relative to wheat as a bit of a benchmark. Yes, but wheat prices have gone up 170% since last year, but the cereal hay prices have more than trebled in that same time. A massive spike. We've never seen hay prices like it, and we are off the charts with record prices. How does vetch hay, canola hay, cereal hay all fit in together? This is a map, at least a graph, showing how cereal hay in the brown has been trading recently. The vetch hay in the green generally trades at a $50 a tonne premium to cereal hay. And on paper, that's exactly where canola hay should be trading as well. It's got a similar sort of protein and ME makeup, perhaps a little bit under in terms of protein, but it's pretty comparable. But the market's got a different view, and the market has been, canola hay has been trading less than that $50 premium. Generally it's been coming in perhaps even a little bit under the prevailing prices for cereal hay. The Mallee, it's been trading at about 300, for instance, for canola hay, and those places in the Mallee are closer to those road train routes I was mentioning before, so they often get a premium because their freight up north is cheaper, so they can afford to pay more ex-farm. The further south you are, a lot of the Wimmera canola hay has been trading like a 270 ex-farm, a little bit less. A general rule of thumb for how the quality and prices working this year is that it seems to be trading at around a $25 per unit of metabolizable energy. So that means that if you've got an 11 ME hay, that might be about a $270 a tonne ex-farm price in the Wimmera. Similarly, the protein has been trading at about a $15 a tonne per percentage point, meaning if you've got 20% protein hay, that is trading at around $300 a tonne ex-farm. Just a bit of a guide to you. It doesn't work necessarily all the time, but that's been the trend so far this season. So trying to pull this all together, what does it all mean in terms of which way the cereal hay prices might go? There's a lot, just in terms of the overall market, there's obviously a lot of hay being cut this year. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a big volume, but there is a lot of area being sold. In terms of the canola market and the canola hay itself, in the short term there are reluctant canola hay makers out there. They'd rather be making the grain, and they've got these bales around the place. They really don't want to store it. They're not really geared up for it, don't have the shed. Take it off the farm. Please come and buy it. There's a bit of sell pressure coming in the short term to get that sort of stuff moved. And the reluctance of buyers has been a factor as well. There's rumours getting around about punctured rumens, and I think Brett mentioned that as well. I think that's rubbish myself, but I think it's excellent quality. But getting it tested is an absolute key, and interestingly, by far the majority of those parcels of canola hay that have been trading so far this year, they invariably all have feed tests alongside them. So the snoozers who are out there trying to sell canola hay without feed tests, I think they're going to get punished, and those who've got feed tests will do pretty well. As I've said, the reputation of canola hay is limiting the price, but the hay price is also encouraging the production. You know, people perhaps wouldn't have been so anxious to cut their canola crops this year had they not known that there was massive prices out there for hay. But the demand I'm suggesting for particularly northern New South Wales is not going to be as large this coming season. But some things that might push the prices down may be that there's going to be a massive amount of summer forage around. But that depends on cheaper water, and I don't think that's going to happen either. So that's an unlikely scenario. So to just list some factors that might be really pushing the prices up for canola hay this year. Okay, you can argue New South Wales demand and Queensland demand continues. That will obviously drive up prices. We still need an autumn break, and that typically is the big thing that determines hay prices early in the year. We've got a long way to go before we get another spring. We've got incredibly low carrying price stocks of hay. You know, we've pretty much run out. There were stories we'd run out. Of course, we always carry over hay, but there was very little available for sale. The mallee vetch pretty much gone. There's little snippets of it here and there, but there's going to be no vetch pretty much on the market this year. It's as a protein hay that's replaced by canola. I think there's going to be buyers out there recognising quality, and there is going to be big prices paid, but you really got to make sure you've got the quality to sell. So just to sort of pull it all together in the final things, there's very good volumes of hay out there this year, both cereal and canola. Canola is the most traded hay out there at the moment. The cereal hay is just starting to get cranked up, and a lot of the windrows are out there still curing because of the recent rains. The quality should be terrific, but insist on a test, as Brett's mentioned. The actual prices are still evolving, but it's you know, you've got Riverina canola hay and silage trading at around $300 a tonne ex-farm, graduating further south down to about $260, $270 in the southern parts of the Wimmera. So it depends on where you are, what the price is going to be. But currently there's not a lot of things actually trying to pull the prices down. They should remain fairly firm overall. I think that sort of sums up the majority of the things I had to say, Jane.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you, Colin, and very good timing. We now have got sort of 10, 15 minutes for questions, so I will be about to hand over to Jordan to handle that. While I've got you all, I'll ask you all to stay at the end very briefly after the questions, just so that you can answer some quick and very simple poll questions for us about this seminar, because to get these, to fund these seminars, we need that feedback from you to make sure that we can do it. So we will do that right at the end. But in the meantime, I suggest that you ask your questions to both Colin and Brett. I've got a quick one before I hand over to you, Jordan, that came up on the screen earlier about the availability of the slides online. This presentation is being recorded, so the recording with the slides attached will be available online. So I hope that is answering the query that came up. So there's another couple coming up, but I might hand over to you first, Jordan, to work through the process of how people can answer questions on their telephone.
Thanks for that, Jane. Okay, thank you, and welcome to the question and answer session. To ask a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad and wait for your name to be announced. We will now pause for a moment to assemble a queue on the telephone. If you are online, you may ask a question in the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner. Just as a reminder, to ask a question on the telephone, please press *1.
So while you're assembling questions, maybe I can get Brett to address one of the first one that's come up in the chat box, Brett, which is about is only nitrate content. Is it only nitrate content which limits the amount you can feed sheep or cattle?
We're getting into some complex questions with. You can feed canola as a sole part of the diet, and it doesn't. This comes back to any type of feed. It depends on the limiting factors. If you have an underlying issue with any type of vitamin, minerals, or nitrates, or animals that are down in condition, they're going to be more prone and susceptible to some of these types of things. To say that there's a limit on things is pretty hard, because I myself have fed, during 2006, I think I fed canola as a sole part of the diet for 8-9 months without an issue. So to say, like when we talk about these risks, they're out there and you need to look for them, but they shouldn't limit what your decision is. If it's well made and you don't have an underlying issue, you shouldn't have a trouble with it. But if you are having trouble, get some advice, and then you go back to that dilution's a solution. So mix it with another product, find out what the issue is, and there's the ways you should be able to address it fairly cheaply through a vet. So hopefully that's enough of an answer.
I might, Jordan, have you got any questions?
There are currently no questions on the telephone at this time, but as a reminder for those on the phone, to ask a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad and wait for your name to be announced. I'll hand back to you, Jane and Brett and Colin, and you can just address any of the questions that you see there in the chat box. Please go ahead.
Sorry, there are a couple more there for you, Brett. One is about sulfate poisoning.
Yeah, I'll just say that comes under the same as the other one. That,
yep.
It is an issue. It can be an issue, but to say whether it's there or not, you can't judge, and it depends on so many things.
Yep. And then the next one is about whether canola hay bales, separate as biscuits like you do with some of the pasture hay, or do they fall apart like moist cereal hay? That's
I think the balers would still work the same, wouldn't they, Brett?
Yeah.
They'd still fall apart.
Yeah, it does. I've actually got some high-density big squares this year, and they're actually they're staying together a bit more than the others. So yes, the baler's more of an issue than the product.
okay. And another one, we've got a few about sort of minerals and nutrients. Would you feed canola in a selenium deficient area?
Yeah, that comes back to previously, like it's how long's a piece of string. So yeah, you shouldn't have a trouble, but if there's an underlying issue, you need to be addressing the underlying issue. And what you're feeding him might be irrelevant because it might be coming from an area that might be flushing selenium. So it's like all these things you need to be monitoring and checking.
All right.
Yep.
Okay, thanks for that. So, Jane, we'll just pause there. We have one question from Jane. Just one moment. Let me get her online, please. Okay, Jane. Okay, Jenny Anderson, please go ahead.
Oh, hello. At $300 a tonne, which is the better value, the canola silage or lucerne silage? And what would the water content be of each of those?
Well, you'd have to get a feed test to actually differentiate which one's which, because the water content can vary significantly as the price and the energy and protein. So, if you need to get feed tests on those products, and there'll be AgVic staff and other people that will be able to help you interpret those. But
Thank you.
If you're comparing things of similar feed test and of the similar energy, protein and moisture levels, canola is probably a bit more cost effective at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay.
I might just chip in there, Jane.
Yep.
I wanted to clarify something I mentioned in my chat, that was that in the Riverina, canola hay and canola silage they're both selling at $300 a tonne. The silage is selling at $300 a tonne with the moisture rates it's equated to the same as what it is for hay, if that makes any sense at all. So it's the same dry matter that you are buying at $300 a tonne. So it's not a wet weight at $300 a tonne for canola silage.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's amazing. Thank you.
All right. So just as a reminder, if you're on the phone to ask a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. All right. We will now return to some of the questions in the chat box there, Jane. Over to you.
Okay, we have one, I think probably either of you could answer this, but it's really about if someone's making silage, canola silage, when would be the best time to perform your feed test on the silage in terms of after 3 or 4 weeks curing, or when you cut it, or when? Any comments there?
Yeah, I'll have a crack at it. Ideally, you could do it after curing, but it depends what if you're upfront about it, you can collect it up front. When I mean upfront, to talking to your buyers, you can collect it up front. The moisture content and energy and protein content will change slightly, but once it's wrapped in plastic and once that silage process has gone on. So ideally you'd do it post, but if you're only after a simple moisture test on a dry tonne basis, as it's leaving the property, you could do it before, but obviously waiting 3 or 4 weeks would give you a lot more accurate result.
I've got a question here that says for Colin, but it might actually be Brett that talked about it. It's just about explaining why the cracking of the canola hay is important. Was that you, Brett, that talked about that?
Yeah. It's to do with palatability of the mouth. So it's just a lot more easy for the cattle and sheep to chew and swallow. So it's actually more of a comfort thing. Obviously, the cracking of the stem does help with the curing process as well, but it does make a difference to palatability, and it's just because of that outer stalky casing on the plant.
But by cracking, you're referring to conditioning, I'm assuming, Brett?
Yes, yeah. So conditioning or macerating, which is a type of machinery process people like to refer to. But yeah, if that step's cracked all the way along, they'll be more than adequate. And some of the lighter stuff will be fine this year that it's not cracked because it was a later season. But you know, if you're buying it cold, I'd be making sure that it's been conditioned. That's what general consensus is.
Yep, I have another one. I'm not quite sure what it's getting at, but it's what's the best way to feed out silage to mobs of 100 or 200 assumed cattle that are used to eating square cereal hay out of bales and oats in a feeder. So I'm not sure if it's a practical methodology of actually feeding out silage to large mobs. Do you want to make maybe some comments about the best way to feed out silage to?
So I'd suggest just feeding it the normal way. There's not really a different issue. Whatever way you've been used to using. So you know, this year I'd be reluctant to suggest anyone spend a lot of money on extra infrastructure. But obviously, whatever way you've been feeding it out, try and keep it consistent that your animals are used to. But just if you've got sufficient head spacings and you're keeping the cattle and sheep from walking on it, usually reduces your wastage quite significantly.
Yep, good. Any phone questions, Jordan?
No, there's no more further questions on the phone, it seems.
Okay, we've still got a couple to get through on the chat box. A quick one, I think. Best moisture, or I suppose, yeah, best moisture, recommended moisture level for baling canola at. Probably you again, Brett, and I presume we're talking canola hay, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, like ideally, you know, it differentiates between pit silage, round bale silage, and hay. You know, ideally, yeah, you just want to stick to your normal ranges. So, you know, in your 10 to 15% for hay, and silage is around your 50 for bale silage, and then you know your pits are a little bit wetter again. But yeah, just there's the top fodder book, and there's also a lot of resources if you type in top fodder online about making hay silage, and yeah, that's freely available.
Yeah. Let's go back to, I think, the question about feeding it out when they use the feeders. If I've got it right, the right person, they've clarified that they're feeding actually to sheep, and they haven't fed, I think, silage before. So it's, I guess it is that physical thing about just cutting the plastic wrapping off. And I mean, I've fed it, and just depending on what infrastructure you've got to feed it out to sheep in terms of spreading it out. Otherwise, it's cutting the wrapping pretty well and
maybe just getting the sheep accustomed to it as well, Jane.
Yeah, so transition that diet. So you know, put a bale out when they're not hungry. So you know, like when you just say if you're feeding wheat, you know, keep feeding wheat for a day and have that canola there to pick on, and then just let it swap over instead of just cutting one off and starting on the other.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in response to a couple of the questions before, Brett, too, is I know you mentioned it in terms of that dilution recommendation, but we always used to sort of say, particularly with new feeds, you know, maybe, you know, you don't feed more than 60% of the diet, you know, of canola hay or something. So, you know, that's another option if you're worried about certain things that you don't, that, you know, it's not 100% of the diet that you're feeding of one product. Now I've got a comment here, and I think this comment's for you, Colin. It says $300 per tonne was mentioned as a price for canola hay and silage. So if the silage is 50% dry matter, that means $600 per tonne of dry matter. Do you want to make any comment about that?
I was hoping that I could yeah, clarify that one. It's the canola hay, the canola silage is selling at $300 per tonne with the equivalent moisture content of hay. It's a confusing thing. You need a spreadsheet in front of you, but it's not $300 a tonne wet as is. That's the take-home message. So it's actually dry matter for dry matter, exactly the same price as the hay price when it's selling as canola.
Yeah, it's one of those points of clarification when you're buying it, isn't it, Colin, that you're buying what you're buying your feed on, that you're buying it on a dry or a wet
Correct,
basis,
correct.
so that you know exactly what it is you're buying and you're not paying for water.
That's right. So there's three different ways that it seems to be trading, and everyone's different, but it can be dollars per tonne on a dry matter basis, which is quite a high price. At the other end of the extreme, you've got $1 per tonne on a wet basis, or as is, and that's generally the cheapest price. And then in between, you've got the dollars per tonne on a same moisture basis as hay, which is, you know, as Brett said, somewhere between 10 and 15%.
Terrific. Now it is just after 2 o'clock. Before I hand over for the quick questions, there's just I think it's come from Greg Ferrier, if I'm wrong, but just suggested making a mention of the potential risk of fire in storing, I guess, wet products. Brett or Colin probably could answer. Do you want to make any comments about the risk of?
I'm quite happy to have a go. Fire risk is going to be really good. Try not to be flippant. What we see in dry seasons is that mistakes are sometimes made. So because we're cutting immature crops, in 2006 and 7, a lot of the hay that was caught on fire was from growing points that weren't properly cured in the hay, and the high sugar content and extra moisture. The risk is going to be increased this year, but this comes back to getting a feed test and checking your product. And unfortunately, even if you do take all the best precautions, because we're getting these early cut crops, sometimes you do get a little bit of regrowth coming back through. So if some of that's picked up, by default you can accidentally pick up some stuff, even with all the fantastic machinery we've got. We've just at home increased our hay insurance, and it's probably best to check with your company. We found out that if you're storing more than $40,000 worth of product, it needs to be split into more than one lot. So that's with our company. I'd be checking with your own, so just to make sure that you're meeting the criteria.
Great. Thank you. Go, Colin.
I was wondering what your view would be, Brett, on the risks of canola hay being, setting alight spontaneously compared to cereal grains. I'd not heard of any canola hay spontaneously combust.
Not usually, but I've already seen some one stack get hot already that was well made, so it still can happen. Yeah, and this comes back to just checking your moisture levels again. Agriculture Victoria will be putting out some media releases on haystack fires and testing hay in the next week or two, certainly in the north, and they'll follow out in the hay season down south later. And there's also a fair bit of stuff online on our website about haystack fires. So certainly you can test with crowbars and moisture meters and that type of look. But yeah, there will be an increased amount of fires happen this year already, but to say who, where and where they are, it'll be the same as normal. You just won't know, but for the amount of product that's being made, they're still really going to be low incidences overall. But yes, certainly be careful and monitor your stacks where you can.
Great, thank you, Colin and Brett. It's after 2:05, so I would like to wrap it up, but could everyone just stay online for really a very brief time, and I'll hand over to you, Jordan, again, and just to run the poll. I'll just flip through a couple of the screens with where you can ask some of the contact details while you do that. But over to you, Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, and we will now begin the polling segment. For those of you on the webinar platform, please submit your responses via the survey form that has appeared on your screen now. You should see that to the right of the slide. For those on the teleconference, please listen to the following instructions carefully. Question 1. How satisfied were you with this event? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very dissatisfied and 10 being very satisfied. Question 2. After listening to the webinar, has your confidence level to make livestock decisions in dry seasonal conditions increased? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 strongly disagree or 10 strongly agree. Our last question is, would you recommend this type of event to others? Response 1 is yes and 2 is no. If you could now wait a few moments while we get responses from you, an operator will dial out to you shortly. Please stay on the line. And just as a reminder for those of you online, if you could please submit your answers in the survey on the right-hand side of your screen there. I can see now that we've had a fair few submissions from about half. So if you haven't done so yet, please just click one of the multiple choice questions there and hit submit for us. Thank you. Just as a reminder, people on the phone, question 1, how satisfied were you with this event? Question 2, after listening to this webinar, has your confidence level to make livestock decisions in dry seasonal conditions increased? And question 3, would you recommend this type of event to others? Please stand by as we dial out to you to get your responses. While we do that, I may just hand back to Jane. We have all of our operators now just getting the poll answers for the people online, but if you have any closing comments, please do so.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. And while they're coming in, I'll reiterate and say thank you very much both to Brett and Colin for presenting today. As I said at the beginning, I think the great thing about revisiting scenarios is we do learn, and I think we've really learned from a couple of very experienced people in this field. I hope everybody has found this really useful. I have put up on the screen contact information, so if there's a question that you would have liked to have asked and you haven't, please feel free perhaps to send it email to me, and I can forward it on to the right person, Colin or Brett, and hopefully we can answer that. The other slides that are up on your screen, if you would like some more information from Agricultural Victoria's dry season support web pages, those links are up on your screen. I'm just scrolling through them now, so I hope that you can have easy access to those. But all in all, I guess to all of you, I really hope that you found this a useful webinar, and that I wish you all the best in getting through the next few months of feeding. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. That concludes the Feeding Canola Hay and Silage to Livestock teleconference. Thank you once again for joining us today, and you may all now disconnect.